Hello, you're listening to the latest season of the COVID Inquiry podcast. This week, Nicola, along with her guests, are going to reflect on how the recent hearings went and look forward to the next few days of evidence. Please note, some listeners may find the contents of this podcast distressing.
Hello everyone, this is Nicola Brook from Broudie, Canter Solicitors. I'm here on behalf of COVID bereaved Families for Justice, and I'm joined today by Clara Collingwood, who is Campaign Manager for COVID bereaved Families for Justice UK. Also here with us for the first time is Peter Munro. He is the Coalition Policy Manager for the UK Anti-Corruption Coalition, and Gavin Hayman from Open Contracting Partnership, which works on transforming public procurement around the world. Thank you everyone for joining us today.
Thank you very much.
Thank you for having us.
This week started with Pete Weatherby, our barrister, doing the opening submissions on behalf of COVID-19 bereaved families for justice. And normally this is something that I think a lot of our members really look forward to, because it's one of the key opportunities for our position and our questions to be stated from the beginning of the module to then be answered later on. But this was a particularly harrowing and upsetting opening submissions, because instead Pete Weatherby had to speak about questions that we knew we had no chance of answering because of the scope and the witnesses who have been called in this module for the inquiry. I wonder how I'd be like to hear how other people have found what you thought were the highlights of the opening submissions and what you thought was really valuable, and if there are any further questions that you think haven't been addressed.
So the chair started off the hearing with an introduction that basically said she understood that some people were of the view that the inquiry should be hearing from suppliers, but that she was of the view that she didn't need to. This has been a big concern of ours for quite a while, and it's something we've made repeated submissions about. And obviously it's something that the press were also exercised about. Now, Richard Wald-Casey, he is counsel to the inquiry, and he started his opening by posing the question that is really at the centre of this module, which is whether the public purse was exploited for personal gain by those with close connections to government, whether there was corruption, cronyism, and misuse of public money. And essentially, Pete Weatherby answered that by saying it really is beyond argument from open source material, never mind what the inquiry has gathered, that certain politically connected individuals gained massively from contracts to supply PPE and medical provisions during the pandemic, and that some of those companies failed to deliver what they were paid for and were profiteering and price gouging. He also pointed out that, to the dismay of the families, the inquiry has chosen not to call any of those who were suppliers in the questionable contracts. And he drew particular attention to contracts awarded to Mela Designs, SG Recruitment, and although Dyson wasn't awarded a contract, there are emails and documentation that is particularly concerning about how that whole tendering was handled. So that was really what we wanted to set out about why those people weren't being called to account for their involvement, and the questions that really we have that we aren't sure can be answered because only one half of the contract is being called to give evidence.
Thank you. If Peter and Gavin, you don't want to jump in here, I will move on to talking about expert evidence, if that's okay.
No, I think we'd be happy to comment on this, and Gavin, please do come in after me if I've missed anything. But I think we share the opinion COVID bereaved in terms of it is disappointing that suppliers aren't being asked to come forward to give evidence. That's certainly our position. We've raised it at the other preliminary hearings, as have others. I think there's a relatively broad consensus among those core participants that aren't on the government side in terms of bringing forward those suppliers. In our opening submission, I think Chris Smith made a really good point about other inquiries, Horizon, IT, Post Office, the cladding and Grenfell inquiry, that suppliers are brought in those situations, and it's been a huge hugely important moment to hear from them and find some accountability there. So we do find it really disappointing that suppliers haven't been brought. I think also, and we'll get to this later, as the week's gone on, the role of suppliers has become even clearer in the way that this is going, in the way that the inquiry are asking questions. And particularly the inquiries say that they're looking at the government role rather than the kind of supplier end. It would make sense, but obviously they work in tandem. You can't necessarily separate that when it comes to practice. So I think that there's a huge mistake here, and we definitely think that the suppliers need to be called.
I totally agree. And yeah, how do we manage to buy so much bad stuff, right? And spend so much money on that in a way that distracted away from the emergency response and helping frontline people, keeping them safe and protecting families, right? Those suppliers that took so much money and let the country down as hour of need should be called to explain themselves. It just seems really vital, both for just public integrity and accountability, that they are put on the stand and quizzed and held accountable. And I think that's an absolutely vital function of the inquiry and one that's been missed for sure.
Thank you. I think that from the evidence that I've seen across the week, what's really emerged, and you guys have just spoken to this, is the idea that goes against Lady Hallett's ruling, because I understood that Lady Hallett wasn't calling these suppliers on the basis that her focus was on making recommendations for those with the power to inform these systems going forward and to make these procurement deals. However, very clearly from a lot of the evidence coming out about the way that civil servants have had to work, for example, it is very clear that these suppliers did wield huge amounts of power, but that power, because it isn't being held to account in the inquiry, is still very shadowy. I think that for me has been the most interesting thread to emerge from this first week of the module. I wonder what, Nicola, you think has been some of the most important evidence from the experts in regards to this?
Well, I know when you say expert, you're referring to Albert Sanchez Grales, but actually, not to embarrass Peter and Gavin, but they, along with Chris Smith, are also experts in this area of procurement. And just picking up on the opening submission made on behalf of UK Anti-Corruption Coalition, it seems like a really, really simple point, but it's one that needed to be made. And Chris Smith said this: our collective belief was that lives were unnecessarily put at risk and lost, and taxpayers' money was wasted on a colossal scale because of the approach that the UK took to purchasing of PPE. And again, another really simple point, he said, in the spectrum of things that this government buys, it goes from atomic bombs to zero emission buses, that PPE should be a relatively simple thing to buy. And yet the absolute mess that was made, and I'm afraid the evidence we heard from Max Cairnduff towards the end of this week, who was responsible for some of the responsible for the PPE in the VIP lane, he really showed his ignorance when Philip Dale, on behalf of FEMHO, asked him about the approach to purchasing PPE that was compliant with regulations under equality. And his response was, well, a mask is a mask. And that just showed his complete ignorance, because anyone who's been paying attention to any of the inquiry will know that no, a mask isn't just a mask. And the problem has been that most masks don't fit all faces, and you have to have a full spectrum of masks. And the fact that even now he is carrying that mistaken belief just shows how bad procurement was in the UK, because they didn't know how to purchase what was needed, despite PPE being a relatively common purchase that was being made all the time by the NHS.
I'm happy to chime in here if it's helpful too. So, so to just explain our submission, there was also, as you said, absolutely brilliant and insightful, testimony from Professor Sanchez Grails, who's a professor of economic law at Bristol, and he's a public procurement expert both in the UK and Europe. So his testimony was very powerful and very credible. And it's completely aligns with us to explain my organisation. We work in about 30 different countries around the world. So everywhere from South America through to North America, Europe, Africa, Asia. We're helping to reconstruct Ukraine. So we really know about public procurement, digital tools and everything else. And what was striking, both from Professor Grails' testimony in our monster testimony we put together as UK Anti-Corruption Coalition, is there are some really smart, really sensible strategies for emergency procurement. Yes, it was an emergency. Yes, the markets were in chaos. And that's the point where you really have to get smart, and buyers have to meet suppliers, and you have to kind of coordinate things. And what's so striking and so remarkable about the UK response was the absence of that coordination and smart behaviour. And I think it really came across in both testimonies from our group, Professor Grails, about there were so many normal emergency procurement procedures that could have been followed that weren't. So, for example, without getting technical about it, you can have buyers lists. You say, who has PPE of this standard? You list the detailed specifications you need. And when people say, yes, I've got it, they go on a list that provides all the authorities need to buy PPE. You go with capped prices. That's what Germany did. That's the open frameworks of Canada. You can set up a very clear digital process to qualify and you deal with the many people who are offering to help. None of that was done by the UK, and that's absolutely remarkable. And we go into this with about 180 pages of really going through this in atomic detail. But there were so many sensible things that you can do to manage emergency procurement, and the UK didn't do any of those. We'll get into what it did do in a moment with the VIP lane. You're absolutely right. What the UK did was a remarkably old school paper-based approach that was based on special pleading, and it's up a special lane, obviously for political referral from they call it a high priority lane. There's nothing high or priority about it. It was just based on the quality of political referral, and that was a distraction from that approach. And in our evidence, we showed that actually had a higher failure rate than the other leads that were coming in. And so that is still, to my mind, a devastating critique and something that the inquiry really needs to get to the bottom of.
Mm. That's really, really useful information for our members in kind of decoding some of what's going on, because most people don't really have this kind of expertise into procurement systems. All we know is the devastating impact of when it goes wrong. And I wonder, Peter, if you have a sense of, our barrister has spoken a lot and kind of brought up questions that really expose how this was a symptom of underpreparedness. But if you think it's just underpreparedness, or if there's something wider in regards to corruption that you could speak to.
Well, I think as the UK Anti-Corruption Coalition, we always get asked these questions, was this person corrupt? Was that person corrupt? And I think that we really don't take it lightly when we kind of use those words. I think that it may have been symptomatic at the time. We as a coalition have worked not just on public procurement. It's a huge, issue area. A third of public spending is on procurement, a huge corruption risk. As Gavin said, he works internationally in lots of different countries. But we also work on matters of political integrity as well, in terms of political donations, lobbying and having second jobs when in Parliament, appointments to the House of Lords that may or may not be legitimate. So we work on all of these issues, and I think we definitely found at the time that there was a huge dip in public trust in politics. And I think that the COVID PPE scandals was a huge part of that. You also had a few other kind of second job scandals at the time as well. I think that there's been, and I think Transparency International's corruption perception index really dropped the UK scoring. I can't remember around that time as well. Like I can't remember off the top of my head. I think they dropped from like 10th to 18th. In the years between, due to that perception that there is a corruption issue here. So whilst we wouldn't necessarily point, that this person's corrupt, that person's corrupt, I think that we're definitely right to be asking the questions around some of the political integrity issues that came forward from this. But I think also there's an issue of ill preparedness as well. I don't just kind of want to play that corruption card, and I think we heard that from the evidence as well. A lot of these individuals were working hard, everyone was under pressure, but clearly decisions were made that were poor, did not represent good procurement practice as we know them internationally. And therefore, I'm talking about the call to arms, specifically is something that's come up this week as being a factor in creating the VIP lane, which I know we might want to get onto. So I think that there's a range of things here that we can point to in terms of why it was a failure. I think that the corruption risk is a huge one, but also just poor decision making that was made.
And the risk of this not coming out properly in this inquiry has a real life impact on when the next pandemic hits, which we know it will. With that comes huge amounts of government powers that we're not used to having to accept. And this inquiry should be and I think all of our lawyers and all of our groups are working really hard to make sure that it is the mechanism that means that when we're asked to take on these massive restrictions in the future, we trust it. But it's a bit of an uphill battle when you can only speak to certain witnesses. Talking of which, would anyone else like to talk us through any other kind of important points of expert evidence from the first week, or would it be worth moving on to the other witnesses that we heard from the government and the civil service, for example?
I think we have to address the evidence of Professor Albert Sanchez Grayles, who was the inquiry expert on procurement. I hope I cause no offence when I say this, but as a lawyer, procurement isn't the most interesting area of law, I'm afraid.
So true.
However, what the professor managed to do was break it down into really simple, easy to understand stages, and explained why it was important. So first of all, he explained what it is. So procurement regulation tries to ensure that the expenditure of public funds is transparent, is accountable, so that we can prevent corruption and ensure value for money. All of that, perfectly understandable, makes complete sense. And I think everyone would agree that was the aim. And he also explained that those apply even in an emergency, and perhaps more so because essentially when the government is saying we're in crisis mode, we need all you've got of this particular thing, of course lots of people are going to say, well, I've got that particular thing, but I'm going to charge you triple the price because I know how much you need it and I'm going to take advantage of that. Now, you would hope in a global emergency that people would see the greater good, but we also know that that's not what happened. And we know from the evidence of the professor that transparency and fairness go hand in hand, except we then heard from one of the government witnesses, I think his name is, Sir Gareth Rees-Williams, who agreed that transparency and fairness were important. But when pushed, he said, transparency, yes, absolutely. Fairness, if you can. And this is where we come to the VIP lane, because obviously the idea of competition goes out the window. And so essentially he was justifying the VIP lane and how they were able to look at certain contracts without looking at who else was offering and who else might be more competitive. And he also talked about transparency in terms of the late publication of contract award notices. He accepted that that did undermine transparency. And what he said about this was interesting. He said, "It's one of my big, deepest regrets because it's allowed concerns to multiply." Now, to me, that sounds like he was concerned not about how it was, but how it looked, and that it allowed those naughty journalists to kind of speculate and be suspicious. So he wasn't really portraying that he was concerned about how it actually was or that it stopped people from scrutinizing those contracts. He was just concerned that it gave journalists the ability to kind of point and say, "You've not done this, there must be a reason." And I think that was a very telling exchange from him.
And in relation to Dr. Albert Sanchez Grail's evidence, he also spoke, I think I'm right in this, about how the VIP lane can't really be understood as being anything other than unlawful, which you've just touched on. What would be the next steps? Obviously, this inquiry can't take into account or isn't a criminal investigation. Is there a kind of road towards getting accountability and justice for an unlawful use of VIP lanes?
So I have a few thoughts here. So first of all, again, I think Professor Grail's testimony was just a very brilliantly simple way of explaining public procurement. You're right, it's dull, but what it gets you is absolutely vital. It's a third of all government spending, and it's crucial for all the roads, schools, hospitals, everything we rely on, right? So that's why it's so important. There are some basic ground rules about how you do that in a fair way. The only way we ever found out about the VIP lane, remember, was litigation, right, from the Good Law Project and others that first revealed this special vehicle had been created almost by accident. And that's something the inquiry should be getting to the bottom of as they look forward to testimony from Michael Gove and others who were there at the time it was created and everything else. And it was found to be unlawful in the High Courts as a breach of equal treatment, right, and so on. So it is perfectly sensible to have a process to qualify and prioritize leads, but it needs to be a professional one that is a fair and objective judgment about the credibility of the cases. The VIP lane was none of that. It was created almost by accident. So to explain what we know from the High Court litigation, something we go into in detail in our submission to the inquiry, effectively the government says, who's got PPE? And rather than then giving very good, very clear instructions about the quality of what they need and the requirements and creating an orderly process to qualify people and make that accessible to many public buyers in the UK, which loads of other countries did very effectively and very, very clearly, they created some sort of special process where politicians were phoning up and saying, "Hey, I've got a friend who's got some PPE." They said, I think in the High Court testimony, they would robustly follow up and chase up. And so they created a special process for handling the political referrals, which became the VIP lane. Extraordinarily, you were 10 times more likely to get a contract if you were referred to by a politician. There's no evidence anywhere in the world at all that politicians knew who had stocks of PPE and were good at qualifying leads in relation to that, particularly on technical stuff. Virtually every other country, and as I said, we work in about 30 plus countries, let procurement professionals take the lead and set the process in place. And instead, we had the politicians steering the process here with disastrous results. It's absolutely clear that the failure rate was higher, right, for COVID PPE stuff, according to the evidence and the logic that we've seen. And then more generally, one of the other things I think that beyond the VIP lane that's worth looking at is just the UK's emergency response is just way different from all its European peers. So we scrape together as the UK Anti-Corruption Coalition. So we're all like data analysts and experts at looking at the actual patterns and the facts. And we compared the UK's response to many of its European peers like Germany, France, and elsewhere. And what's also remarkable is just the sheer amount of stuff the UK bought. It was rather than stocking up 6 months, it chose to stock up for 5 years. And the UK relied on sole source contracts with no competition, a lot more than its European peers, and kept buying and buying and buying. So my images of this like runaway engine of COVID PPE, and was like buying more and more stuff that was going to be less and less useful from ever more like slightly questionable provenances. And that's why we see such huge mounds of stuff getting burnt now and everything else. So, and the facts are really clear. We laid this out in our testimony, and I think it was one of the particularly powerful points of the inquiry. It was just looking at just how disproportionate the UK was. And then you said about what assurance does that give you in future? And that's such an important question, because once you get used to like sole sourcing and special contracts and with no competition, it's all the academic evidence suggests that governments rely on that far too much in future. So we really need to rethink things. The one ray of light, if I may, it's not all bad news, is the UK now has a new Procurement Act. And in that, they've really thought through a lot more the chain of commercial transparency and data. That means they should have much more data-driven responses like other countries have. So, I work in Ukraine or Colombia or Lithuania. They all had open data-driven dashboards with all the PPE contracts being put on there in about 24 hours. The UK had nothing like that. And indeed, our evidence showed that actually, if you took the COVID PPE contracts, they were uniquely late out of all UK contracts. So people might say, oh, it was COVID and it was a bit of a challenge. But there's no reason why the single most important contracts you're agreeing that are going to protect like nurses' lives on the front line are, almost 125 or more days later than all other contracts. At the time you most need the information, they were most redacting that and hiding that information. That's a real shame and a huge misfire. So I think there's so many lessons that can be learned. And I think the new Procurement Act and the new data-driven approaches are a really good opportunity for the government to systematically rethink this. And that's why I think the inquiry should be giving really robust recommendations around that.
In terms of Sir Gareth Rhys-Williams's evidence, he spoke a little bit about the motivations that could have gone into some of the pressure that was being put on the government and particularly in relation to Dyson products. And he said that there didn't seem to be any motivation regarding any donation to a connection to the Conservative Party. And I wonder, maybe Peter, you could speak about what you think's lying behind this then, and what the best chances are of finding this kind of thing out, and also how important is that? Or, as Gavin's kind of just spoken to, do we have the information that we need to put in really robust recommendations that will prevent any kind of bad acting like this, regardless of what that actual power that they were wielding was?
Yeah, I think some really good questions, and apologies in advance because I'm probably not going to be able to give excellent answers on them. I'd be really interested to hear what Nicola has to say about his in terms of those types of questions. I think that there may be some kind of a bit of defensiveness on the sides of the witnesses this week, which I think is fair. They were under a lot of pressure at the time. They're being asked about their record a number of years ago, and you can understand why they may want to play down some of these elements. But I think that I was quite shocked in the room when there was a lot of talk about, because he wasn't the only one. I think there were a few others this week that said things along the line of, well, actually, I disagree with the idea that you were more likely to receive a contract if you had political connections or if you went through the high priority lane. And I was just sat there thinking, but that just flies in the face of all the evidence that we have. There's numerous data points suggesting that you are definitely going to be more likely to have received a contract and money if you were in the high priority lane. And I think for these witnesses to say that that isn't the case, I think it just doesn't compute with the data that we have. We have the NAO report, the National Audit Office report that looked into this, found that 1 in 100 contracts outside. Sorry, you had a 1 in 100 chance if you were outside the high priority lane. However, if you were inside the high priority lane, you had a 1 in 10 chance. And this is the government or its own audit. So I think that to say that you don't have that it's not more likely, I think that's just really disingenuous, and I don't have the answer as to why they would say that. I also wanted to talk about we touched on it before, sorry, you were talking about why will we get the accountability? And I wanted to come back to the evidence that we gave as experts, and talk about an aspect, Gavin's talked at length about the international pieces and things like that. And also Nicola will just ignore your jibe about procurement law being boring and all that kind of stuff. But I think there's a really interesting point here about, procurement. Whilst it might not be, people might not be interested in it, procurement is interested in you, is the the classic statement that's used because schools, roads, hospitals, Gavin and I talk about this all the time. You use it every day, you just don't know about it, and it's really important. And you also talked about, the next pandemic, that's going to be a huge thing, the next pandemic. But I think it's other emergencies too. We talk about industrial accidents and how we respond to those, natural disasters as well. Maybe like climate mitigation is a huge thing. Procurement's going to be huge there. The government is going to be building, trying to build a lot of houses in the next few years. How, what kind of contracts are going to be going on there? So I think that there's a lot of money in procurement, and we really need to be looking into it. In terms of the accountability, I wanted to talk about the 135 contracts that Transparency International and the UK Anti-Corruption Coalition have put forward to the inquiry in terms of red flags. So, to cut a long story short, Transparency International, I think with the help of Open Contracting Partnership as well, have basically put together a list of contracts totaling 135, which amount to 135 contracts that really need to be looked at by law enforcement. I don't think that the inquiry is the only manner that we can get accountability. I think it's definitely one of the strongest. But the Labour government have also put forward the COVID Corruption Commissioner, maybe it's called something else now, the COVID, something commissioner, that's essentially tasked. Yeah, it's essentially tasked with, getting back some of the contracts, looking at the suppliers in a bit more detail than the inquiry is. We're a bit disappointed at the moment because, it was a big pre-election manifesto commitment, we're going to get this money back. But it turns out that, now it's, 3 days a week, and, it's only going to be running for 1 year. So we've had meetings with Mr. Hayho, who is going to be in charge of this, and we've given the 135 with the reasons as to why they need to be looked at more, whether it was like a political referral, was it a company that was set up yesterday, did they have no prior experience of creating PPE, all these different red flags that you can point to. So I think that in terms of accountability, this isn't the only avenue in terms of the inquiry. There are other ways that we can do this. But I think it's an uphill battle, and as Gavin pointed out, it is mainly due to the work of investigative journalists, due to the work of litigation. The government aren't going to be so forthcoming on this, so I think that we have to do quite a lot of the work ourselves.
I just wanted to speak about Dyson and put your question in context, really, for anyone who hasn't had a chance to listen this week. The issue around the Dyson is Dyson was apparently championed by both Michael Gove and the then Prime Minister Boris Johnson. He had put himself forward in the ventilator challenge to basically design and build a brand new ventilator because the country was running out of ventilators. That sounds laudable, great. We need ventilators. He's going to invent some and build them and give them, all great. The issue is, and Pete's referred to this in our opening submission, it's summed up neatly in this email that was sent by Lord Agnew. And it says, we are going to have to handle Dyson carefully. I suspect we'll have to buy a few machines, get them into hospitals so that he, i.e. Dyson, can then market internationally, being able to say that they are being used in UK hospitals. We both need to accept that it will be a bigger decision than we can make. Remember, he got a personal call from the Prime Minister. This can't be ignored. So this is what we're talking about. Now, at this stage, the Dyson ventilators hadn't been licensed. And so they were talking about putting those ventilators into UK hospitals so that Dyson would be able to market them internationally. And they're talking about the personal call from the Prime Minister. What relevance does that have into whether this is a viable purchase for the UK? What relevance does that have into whether this ventilator works? And some of the evidence we heard this week was, well, don't worry about it because he didn't get the contract. So what's your issue? Well, he didn't get the contract because the licensing authority wouldn't give him the license because essentially he couldn't prove that it would work to the standard that was required. But still, we had evidence that calls were made to the MHRA, the licensing authority, about this issue. So any suggestion that these political connections didn't have an impact on how they were dealt with internally by our government is just not true. The fact that the contract wasn't awarded in the end, great, that's good that, the MHRA stepped in and wouldn't create that authorization that was needed. But there was certainly, if pressure is too strong a word to use, there were certainly calls being made and emails being sent in an effort to make that happen.
I think that's one of the most shocking examples, and it's because I think there's a kind of name that we can tie to it that it really sticks in my head and in the head of quite a lot of our members. But I think, there's some of the evidence that Daniel Bruce gave, just behind that, the figures of, 25% of high priority lane suppliers being provided with PPE that was wasted is so shocking. And I wonder how much more, if we had been able to have more of these kind of named suppliers being called to account, these numbers would kind of seep out into our kind of collective understanding of this a bit more. Because as someone as everyone around here is campaigning on this issue, it's almost kind of too shocking to really feel about, I don't know how to start framing this, the kind of the scale of wastage. And I think what was quite good about the beginning of the module was that we did hear from people who had suffered on the front line because of it. And I think that those voices really stuck in my head when, again, Sir Gareth Rees-Williams spoke about how there was a need to get PPE in, even if it wasn't the perfect PPE. And I'm thinking again about what that would have felt like on the front line if you're given PPE that simply doesn't keep you safe and you're not told that it's not going to keep you safe. And it speaks to a lot of what both Peter and Gavin have been saying about how the inquiry is such a useful tool for us, because this would have been so shrouded. We wouldn't understand any of this as a campaigning group without all of this evidence being given, and this discussion as well. But it is also, there's a question about what happens next. If you are someone, understanding is only the first step in making sure that everyone who has to go to work with PPE is equipped to hold to account people who are making decisions that shape their lives and can be decisions of life or death. I wonder if we could move on now, I think, to some more of the government witnesses towards the end of the week. If there are any kind of key issues that you think would be really useful for COVID bereaved families for justice to have a kind of sense of from you.
Sure. I'll come in on this point, but it does link to what we were just talking about, so it won't change the topic too much. There was evidence suggesting, and we're talking about suppliers, threats from suppliers to go to the media if their referral wasn't being chased, or if the civil servant officials weren't moving the process forward as fast as they could in terms of the high priority lane. I think that was actually quite new evidence for me. I don't know, Gavin, if you knew about that, but suggestions that suppliers who the narrative is we're all in this together, we're all trying to get as many items to the front line as possible. But if their main interest is their own profit, and they're saying that they're threatening, officials that are working on this to go to Piers Morgan, I think was the example. I don't know what they would say. I'm kind of interested in what their end game is in terms of, you're going to go to Piers Morgan to complain that you're not getting the right treatment that you deserve during this pandemic. I don't know what their strategy is there, but the fact that they're willing to kind of make that move, I think is really horrible to hear about. So I think that that's something that was quite shocking to me. In terms of other things, I think that and Nicola, interested to hear what you think. My main takeaways were there was a lot of regret, I think, about the VIP lane. I think that a lot of it, you're right to say, a lot of it was about perceptions and kind of how it looked, and a lot of it was about, well, it shouldn't have been called a VIP lane or a high priority lane. It should have been called this. I think it's regrettable that that was the focus of what they were thinking about. But I think I certainly felt in the room that there was an understanding that if it was to happen again, maybe because they were caught, that this wouldn't happen again. It's not necessarily enshrined in law. We talked about the Procurement Act earlier. We do think that those measures should go a bit harder in terms of making sure this doesn't happen again. But I think that there is sufficient public pressure to know that if we are in an emergency situation, then it will be dealt with a bit, in a better way. I think also it was really interesting, a main theme that came out was just the high priority lane, VIP lane, and all of these things. A lot of it was, about political referrals and political connections, but a lot of it was about handling ministers, which I think is quite an interesting way of looking at it. I have a background in politics and have worked in Parliament and understand that politicians often need handling and things like that. But the amount of time that was taken up by people who are working hard to solve these problems, the fact that they had to worry about getting chased by ministers because of a political donor, perhaps, that's chasing them. And it really just took up what was already incredibly stretched bandwidth, is just really shocking. So I think that that's something that really needs to be looked at. And I hope that, as the inquiry goes on, we will look at more political witnesses and we can really ask those questions of, well, why were you harassing all these people who were really trying to work hard to, for the country. So I'll leave that there. But I think this, as the inquiry goes on, there's still a lot to come out on this.
Apologies. I was really struck by that same point, Peter, right? The whole purpose of procurement law is to keep politicians away from trying to unduly influence the spending of public money, right? And this is the absolute opposite of that. The politicians, ended up in charge of an entire a new process was set up purely to satisfy them. And it was so evident that regret and reflection, but also how much effort and time it distracted, and then how little strategic and smart thinking there was in the response. And that reflection came across clearly as well. So as that, we work in so many other countries, and the procurement professionals put in charge. It's like, this is a public crisis. You're procurement professionals. You get this sorted and give us a methodology for doing this. Instead, it was like the people were making up. And politicians were like, let's have a lane and we'll refer people. And that's remarkable. And that's where it all seemed to go wrong. I look forward to the inquiry further drilling into that from the instigators of the VIP lane. And then one other thing that's remarkable by its absence is just who was giving the government advice here? Where are those professionals? They're actually saying, well, we really looked at this carefully. We looked at best practices. We looked at what worked in the Ebola crisis, which obviously the UK played a point of response. We actually wrote a blog. One of our core participant members, helped lead the emergency procurement in Ebola, and he just said, you have to be strategic and organised, have really clear processes. And the UK actually didn't have that. It had a PPE cell. It looked like then that was just overwhelmed by political referrals. And then my last observation is just the lack of digital smarts, right? It's just remarkable. They were basically using spreadsheets, right? And SurveyMonkey to coordinate things. It's like a amateurish level of response compared to other countries that had fully digitized procurement systems. And this is something that Labour itself brought up in opposition by really sort of talking about the use of digital tools for public procurement in the Procurement Reform Act, and something we're expecting to see more of. And I think will be a critical lesson the inquiry should really elevate, in that this investment in digital tools would be like a massive time saving and also create much fairer, more effective, much more frictionless, much less paper-based procurement. So I think that's a huge lesson learned for the UK that I expect the inquiry to major on.
Oh, it's really useful starting to think about what your recommendations will be. I think in terms of the Anti-Corruption Commission, we have been campaigning, COVID Bereaved Families for Justice have been campaigning to push to make sure that that goes into things that will save lives in the future, that fund, so kind of public services. But it sounds like we should really wait until you've got these recommendations into the inquiry and the inquiry's made those recommendations to the government. So if they are going to be doing procurement, it's all done the right way. Well, I'm definitely...
I just chime in and say, I think you're absolutely right, though, about the public accountability. So the COVID, I think, Counter Fraud Commission is the new name for it. Yeah, but if you take it, right, it's a very small team where the main person leading it is on, 3 days a week? That's basically, as some body pointed out already, 1 day a high-risk contract. Amazing TI analysis, the 135 contracts with 3 or more red flags. And that's crazy. If you look at the US, they had an entire legal eagle team assembled called the Pandemic Response Action Committee that went through every single contract. And if you fail the British government in its time of need and you waste public money, you should be held accountable. And I think that's essential for public healing and trust building. And why aren't we dismantling these companies and taking them to court for hundreds of millions of dollars of misspent? They failed the country in their hour of need, and they need to be held accountable. And I'm not seeing that urgency, and that baffles me. One thing is partly because perhaps the bad buying practices were so evident, the government doesn't have much recourse, and that would be super worrying. And again, something the inquiry should be drilling into.
Well, despite that, I'm feeling a lot more positive about all of this, having had this conversation when I came into this conversation, because even though there are massive absences in witnesses from the people who supplied who were supplying the contracts to begin with, it seems like this amazing work has really given a roadmap for campaigners and for the inquiry to make sure that this doesn't happen again. I wonder if anyone has any kind of final thoughts on really important parts from this week.
So I think the evidence that we've heard this week is that the VIP lane was created to manage what they are all calling noise. So the referrers chasing up civil servants saying, what's happening with this offer? And Professor Sanchez-Grail said, really, really common sense. Why didn't you just have either an automated response, or you go out to all referrers and say, stopping these people from doing their job. Just leave them to get on with it. Stop chasing them. And the civil servants who've given evidence have pretty much all said that's just not realistic. We can't really do that with ministers. And I think that was very telling. And I suppose for me, my final thoughts would be to really quote from Professor Sanchez-Grail, because this was just so simple and clean and important. And he said, once everything is counted, the volume in pounds of the contracts awarded through the VIP lane make up 50% of all the contracts awarded. And that's stark, potentially very problematic in the context of officials fundamentally downplaying the impact that the VIP lane had, or seeking to justify it. I think the fact that half of the value spent was through an unlawful route should give us pause to reconsider. Those involved don't really recognise that billions of pounds were spent unlawfully, and that is a problem. To me, it speaks to a dysfunctional culture of lesson learning. And that was a pretty damning testimony on how our government worked throughout the pandemic.
It's really hard to follow that up. I think that's some really good final thoughts, but I'll do my best. I think we need to, as kind of a civil society, as procurement experts, I think we need to start getting ahead of the narrative that I think might be forthcoming in the inquiry. And I think that, and we're already seeing it a little bit, and it is that we had to move at speed, and therefore, we could corner cut, and the bottom line was that we had to get items to the front line, to nurses, doctors. So I think on the surface, you can understand that. It kind of makes sense. You think, oh, yes, we do need to get things to the front line. I talked about this when I gave a statement to the inquiry. But my mother, she was not on the front line, but she was a healthcare worker, and got PPE. And as it came off the roll, it would start to disintegrate. My family are all too aware of these kind of issues. But I think that at the political layer, at that kind of official layer, where you're making these kind of decisions with the witnesses that we've had this week, it's not good enough to ignore the fact that there are established best practice procurement methods that go on internationally. Gavin and I, we speak about this at the United Nations. This is not a kind of thing that just comes up overnight and we think, oh, it turns out actually procurement should be done this way and this way. It's an established method of working and a huge corruption risk that's looked at day in, day out. And to put that all aside and say, well, we were trying our best, I just think doesn't cut it. There are but good ways to do this. And to kind of say that, we had to get it to the front line, we had to get it to the front line. It's not good enough. That is true. But these procurement practices are in place. So you can do that effectively and not do that on political referrals. So those are some of my final thoughts.
Yeah, it really matters to get smart, and that's exactly what didn't happen. And indeed, an entirely distracting and ineffective route was created and warped the entire response from that point onwards. And that method had a much higher failure rate than any other method that was used by the UK government. And as I said, we just in our testimony, and as Professor Grales was mentioning, there were so many sensible strategies other countries used. And going back to what you were saying, Nicola, there's a perfectly natural digital workflow you can have to qualify leads, right? And to have people assemble the evidence to show they have PPE of a certain standard and show its safety credentials. And then you have a list of those that's available online that people can pick from with prices. We do this all the time as a small non-profit. We work in countries like Ecuador or the Ukraine that had these, right? Why didn't the UK, right, as one of the richest countries in the world? And that's no excuses at all from the commercial people. I think they know better, and I think there are valuable lessons to be learned. And the UK has the best digital tools. So come on, let's fix this.
Yeah. And just finally, the UK has the second highest death toll in Western Europe. We can't let them get away with saying that they cut corners and changed procedure to save lives. They cut corners and change procedures, and it costs lives.
Thanks for listening to this instalment of the COVID Inquiry podcast. We hope you found it insightful and interesting. If you did, please rate us on the podcast platform you use and share the pod with friends and family who may value this type of commentary. We're looking forward to you joining us next week for more expert commentary, opinion, and insight into the COVID Inquiry evidential hearings.